Professor Dr. Eugen Bleuler, professor of psychiatry at the University of Zurich, authorized by Dr. Charles Richter, assistant in clinical psychiatry, Psychiatric Institute. Affectivity, Suggestibility, Paranoia, by Eugen Bleuler, professor of psychiatry in Zurich. Chapter 1. Affectivity. Psychopathological investigation has finally reached a point where we can go no further with the ordinary conceptions and methods. On the one hand, new conceptions must be created, as Kraepelin has done in his experimental studies. On the other hand, or general concepts and general descriptive terms which are too indefinite and which do not go deep enough must be replaced by more exact ones. Confusion and stupor, for example, are not terms with which one can do very much. One must know upon which of many possible fundamental derangements, hallucinations and delusions, flight of ideas, catatonic paresthesias, retardation, blocking, apathy, such disorders depend in any given case on the best examples of how one may get lost in the unfathomable by working with obscure ideas is shown in the pathology of paranoia and the attempt to explain delusions by disorders of the emotions. Specht speaks of an affect of suspicion as a mixed affect of pleasure and displeasure, without even touching on the question whether suspicion is really an affect in the same sense as pleasure or displeasure. In accordance with his conception, we would have to place pathological suspiciousness by the side of the elated mood of mania and the depressed mood of melancholia, whereas daily clinical observation teaches us that there is a little resemblance between the disorders of paranoia chronica and those of the affective psychosis, as there is between the waves of a stream raised by the wind and the current of the stream. In order to proceed further, it will be necessary to attempt the formulation of a clear conception of what we mean by the term affectivity, a conception with which we can operate and which comprises all that is meant by the terms feeling, mood, affect, and emotion. As we shall see, the word feeling has too broad a significance, while the meanings of the other three words are too narrow, just as is the case in the other fields. Philosophical psychology does not help us to clearly circumscribe our conceptions. The Stoics, in describing the feelings as indefinite cognitions, had in mind something which in most textbooks on psychiatry is not included in the conception of feelings. They taught preeminently of intellectual processes. To the scholastics, the feelings were either a desire for the good or an aversion to the bad. In other words, pleasure and displeasure, to which was added a certain ethical value and a special emphasis upon the voluntaristic principle which is always contained in the feelings. If Hegel calls feelings intelligence on the threshold of its immediateness, and Volkmar, the becoming conscious of the degree of tension of ideation. We cannot deny that these are words which mean little more than nothing to the practical psychologist, the psychopathologist, nor are we any better off when we take into account the explanations which are always indispensable for the understanding of such definitions. Kant expressed himself most clearly and correctly on this subject, but without effect upon his successors, however, whose conceptions are not much clearer than those of the earlier philosophers. In the general part of the textbooks on psychiatry, we find as a rule fairly clear statements. Here pleasure and displeasure in combination with the effects represent the concept to which we refer, but not infrequently psychiatrists go beyond this concept, the limits of which are regarded as self-evident and are not specifically stated. We thus often are led imperceptibly to feelings of security, to the affect of suspicion, to bodily feelings, etc. If we now seek to define in a practical and serviceable manner the idea of feeling, mood, emotion, effect, we must keep in mind the fact that we can make only a theoretical and not an actual distinction between the different qualities which are here concerned. Just as in the simplest sensations of light, we differentiate between the quality, color, shade, the intensity and the saturation, so may we speak of processes of knowledge, intelligence, of feelings, or will, out of we know that no mental process exists in which all three are not combined, even if now one, now another comes into prominence. When we designate a process as affective, we know that this is an abstraction just as much as a color conceived independently of its intensity. We must always remember, however, that the process called affect has also an intellectual and a volitional side, which we ignore as irrelevant in a given case, and that through continual increase in importance of the intellectual and subsidence of the affective factor, a process finally results which we must designate as mainly intellectual. The same may be said about will. We cannot expect, therefore, to divide mental happenings into purely intellectual, purely affective, and purely will processes, but only into principally intellectual, principally affective, and principally volitional. While we keep in mind that many transitions exist, theoretically, however, we must keep the three different sides as wildly apart as, for example, the intensity and quality of a color sensation. Like all psychological expressions, the word feeling originally designated something sensory. It was synonymous with the modern sensation, and this meaning unfortunately yet remains. We feel a prick, feel a fly crawling over the face, we feel cold, or we have a feeling that the floor shakes. Feeling in the first two examples is synonymous with sensation. A feeling cold is usually a rather indefinite feeling, while in the feeling that the floor shakes lies a doubt as to the correctness of the perception. Thus the ambiguous word is entirely unsuitable for us. Instead of it, we will use the expression affectivity, which shall not only designate the affect in the traditional sense of the word, but also the slight feelings or feeling tones of pleasure and displeasure, which accompany all sorts of experiences. Thus, the idea of ordeal is fairly exactly defined. It will occur to no one to designate the feeling of a prick, the feeling of crawling ants, the feeling of swaying by the word affectivity, even though the Latin afficere originally had also a more concrete meaning. Difficulties arise only with the more physical sensations, sight, hearing, and also taste and smell are excluded from the idea of feeling in German and English. One feels neither light nor tone, taste nor smell. On the other hand, the term feeling is ordinarily used with the sense of touch and the other senses connected with the skin, which are not yet adequately defined. It will be easy to separate from affectivity all that is perceived or felt by these latter senses, but with the inner somatic sensations and with pain there exists a certain difficulty in regard to which we must attempt to get some clearness. The kinesthetic sensations, muscle sensations, joint sensations, sensation of tension of the skin, ligaments, tendons, are as a matter of course only mere sensations and have nothing to do directly with affectivity. They are analogous to the sensations of light and sound and give us information concerning the condition of the outer world to which in a psychological sense the body belongs. Or if the analogy be not admitted, we may say they give us information of the condition of the sensory nerves of the muscles, tendons, and joints, exactly as light sensation gives us information of the condition of the retina. But the condition of tension of the muscles has a special connection with affectivity. Certain effects produce tension in our muscles, others relax them, or they cause a different distribution of tension in the different muscle groups. Such forms and combinations of sensations of tension are physical accompaniments, or perhaps better, component parts of affectivity. They have a certain value as regards the position of our body. The amount of movement must be regulated according to the tension, but these sensations scarcely enter consciousness as such, but they form for our inner perception only a component of the effect and are scarcely ever perceived independently. Similarly, palpitation of the heart is primarily a sensation, a perception. Although this sensation is clear and well defined, it is at the same time a symptom and a component part of fear, of anxiety, or of joyful surprise, etc. The same may be said of the sensation of heaviness or lightness about the heart. The majority of physical sensations which as such we do not understand have almost no cognitive value. To be sure, we can ascertain indirectly that all our functions are registered in some manner by the brain and have an influence upon the mind. But our conscious self has not learned to so interpret the incoming stimuli that it knows when the stomach secretes much acid, when the liver forms this or that chemical compound, compound in greater or lesser amount, etc. Thus we can scarcely call these centripetal functions sensations, and it is therefore quite natural that we should still speak of bodily feelings. Their connection with the effects is a double one, a centripetal active and a centrifugal or passive one. All bodily sensations actively influence our mood and even our effects. Thus the depression associated with disorders of the stomach is well known. A small panaritium makes us irritable, etc. On the other hand, physical functions, the heart, vessels, intestines, glands, and through them the bodily sensations are influenced by affectivity. As far as we become conscious of these bodily changes, we are concerned with a cognitive process, i.e., with something intellectual. For the rest, they are symptoms of the effect. Hunger and thirst are often reckoned among the effects, or at any rate the feelings. They are composed of sensations: aching in the stomach, burning in the pharynx, sensations of weakness in the musculature and in the mental apparatus, etc., and feelings of displeasure associated with these sensations, as well as with the general condition. The sensations naturally belong to the cognitive processes, to the intellect in its wider sense, while the feelings of displeasure or pleasure belong to affectivity. The position which pain occupies is not entirely clear. Is it essentially a sensation or an effect? Or does it, like hunger, belong partly to each? The latter seems to me to be the most probable. At any rate, it has a sensory component, or we could not localize it. Moreover, it possesses, like a sensory function, special tracts in the spinal cord and brainstem, perhaps even in the periphery, but it is striking how diffuse is its localization in the cortex, and that analgesia or hyperalgesia might so readily be produced through mental influences. It is, for instance, much easier to produce analgesia than anesthesia by suggestion. We might imagine that these specific sensations of pain are accompanied by such a strong feeling of displeasure that the latter appears as the most important, as the essential element, so that this most frequent kind of displeasure has become the prototype of all negative effects, and we speak in a figurative sense of mental pain and of a painful effects in general. The fact that displeasure, as it seems, might sometimes be separated from the painful effect and might even be replaced by a pleasure, also speaks for a parallel between pain and hunger, i.e., for the supposition that it is a special sensation with an unpleasant feeling tone. With slight pains, such for instance as cause one to touch the affected spot again and again, hollow tooth, it often appears that an increase of pain within certain narrow limits might be connected with a feeling of pleasure. Even excluding masochism, we must also remember that there are pleasurable sexual pains. Further, there are hysterical patients who perceive pain as such, who are therefore not analgesic, and in whom this pain is associated with pleasure. The amphichromatic tickle and the positive sexual pleasure also show a similar combination of sensations with strong effects. All that we have described above as sensation or broadly as a cognitive process, i.e., as an intellectual function, must be sharply separated from the conception of affectivity. The same distinction which we have made in the centripetal must also be made in the more intracentral processes, intrapsychic, intracentral. Indeed, Nachlowski long ago separated the intellectual feelings from the affective ones, yet not so clearly that his separation was generally understood. He understood by intellectual feelings indefinite perceptions, conclusions, and ideas which influence our actions. This act only cumulatively and therefore without becoming clear. I'm sorry. This act only cumulatively and therefore without becoming clear. According to him, we appeal to these feelings only when we lack sufficient ground for a view, assertion, or conclusion, or when we know the grounds in a general way, but are unable to produce them individually and in logical sequence. This woman, according to Nachlowski, are usually led to their views and conclusions by such feelings. Nachlowski, therefore, in speaking of intellectual feelings, has in mind conclusions, the premises of which or the chain of logical reasons of which remain partly or wholly subconscious. Such conclusions and ideas which lack a clear background are very common and play an important part in life, and it is, for example, quite true that women often allow their actions to be governed more by such feelings than by conscious reasoning. Addition: according to Wundt, objective process is opposed to subjective feeling. Others, Wundt, Ziehen, call intellectual feelings, such feelings and effects as accompany composite intellectual processes, in contradistinction to sensory feelings. This employed, the term naturally expresses an entirely different idea from that of Nachlowski's terminology, whose conception of intellectual feelings we shall often have occasion to use. The French also, Pierre Janet, for example, speak of sentiments intellectuels, by which among other things are understood sentiment du déjà vu, du jamais vu, de nouveauté, d'étrangeté, de complétude, and even de cécité. The idea here also is broader than with us and has as little to do directly with affectivity as that which we designate by the name of intellectual feelings. I may have the feeling that such a person's wishes are against me, or that X is a rascal or a fine fellow, or I may have a feeling that a patient has typhoid fever. But in none of these examples do I know why I have this feeling. I would be unable to prove its correctness. Thus I may add that I make fewer mistakes in my preliminary judgments about persons if I follow my instincts than if I try to follow my conscious reasoning. All these are examples of intellectual feelings, in Nachlovsky's sense. But we must get a more comprehensive idea without deciding whether we then depart from the authors or not. The majority of psychologists, including Nachlovsky, conceive of feelings as a species of reactions of our mind to any process, especially one of a centripetal character. Such reactions may naturally be intellectual as well as affective. Thus, Lipps describes a purely intellectual process when he says, I feel certain, or when he speaks of the feeling of certainty. He expresses by the word feeling the knowledge that he thinks or understands correctly. This cognition might be accompanied by a feeling of pleasure or displeasure according to the content of the thought. I am certain that my friend deceives me, or I am certain that I will be promoted. Here, affectivity is something entirely incidental. The affect of suspiciousness, as used by psychiatrists, is somewhat different. This expression does not signify that I have a feeling or inner perception, for example, of being suspicious, but rather a feeling that perhaps someone may do me an injury. In other words, simply an indefinite idea which, according to its content, is accompanied by more or less feeling tone. The corresponding effect need not always be negative. Thus, for example, if in his attack my opponent gives me an opportunity to render him harmless, or if suspicion seems to be directed not toward me but toward my enemy, the effect is positive. The same way be said about the feeling of truth and the feeling of probability, of which Lipps speaks. If we recognize or logically conclude that something is true or probable, this is a purely intellectual process, and it is the same when we become conscious of knowing something to be sure or probable. I.e., when we have the conscious feeling of certainty or of probability. There is great confusion also in the example I feel sad, which Lipps mentions. While this seems to be essentially an effect, the expression indicates in reality only the process of inner cognition, the perception that we are sad, the appreciation of the inner condition, the consciousness of sadness, that which is described by the word feel. Here would remain exactly the same whether I felt happy or sad, just as the perceptive process as such is the same whether I see a cat or a dog. All this we designate as intellectual feeling, not only because the expression was coined for it by Nachlovsky, but also because the uses of speech stubbornly designate it as feeling. But we must clearly remember that this sort of feeling has nothing to do with affectivity but represents intellectual, objective processes. To repeat, intellectual feelings are for one thing indefinite perceptions, conclusions and ideas. As in the above example, when we feel that a patient has typhoid without being able to explain why. And there are also inner perceptions, as in the case of the feeling of certainty. These two kinds of intellectual feelings cannot be so easily separated practically as one might theoretically expect. For example, we speak usually of a feeling of certainty when it rests on an indefinite conclusion or perception. Although the expression as such would designate rather an inner perception, it is as a rule only used when it comprises, at the same time, an indefinite cognition. These intellectual feelings, under certain conditions, play a great role when combined with effects. I have already pointed out that women commonly act according to their intellectual feelings. We must not forget that in our ordinary decisions of life, we seldom have a chance to make all the motives of our acts clear to ourselves. In a discussion, we scarcely have time to grasp our opponent's point of view in all its details and to make it clear to ourselves which of the many possible ways is the best to overcome him. We reply in an irritated, friendly, or differential manner according to our intellectual feelings. Shyness, a mixture of indefinite cognition that someone might do something harmful or injurious to him, and the effects which are associated with this sometimes completely control the conduct and thoughts of a child, etc. On the other hand, we find that under certain circumstances, the feelings with their inhibitions and promptings seem to take the place of logical thinking almost entirely, so that the conduct becomes purely instinctive. Compare the examples of such reactions in children, detailed later on. To sum up, we may add that the word feeling means not only in common speech but also in psychology many different things, such as, first, a large number of contripetal processes, sensations, perceptions, feelings of warmth, bodily feelings. Secondly, intracentral, intrapsychic, perceptive processes. A. With reference to occurrences outside the body, feelings of certainty of probability. B. With reference to the internal conditions, feelings of sadness, sentiment de cécité on French. 3. Indefinite or unclear cognitions, whether it be direct perception or a conclusion, the elements of which are unclear or subconscious. 2 and 3 are united under the name intellectual feelings. Four, the feelings of pleasure and displeasure, to which we must add the effects, the affectivity. 1 to 3 are intellectual processes which are entirely different from affectivity and should not be classed with it. This is not merely an academic separation. It is necessary for everyone in order to study the mode of action of affectivity, and it is only affectivity in this narrow sense that has definite effects upon the body and mind. The other functions separated from it signify in themselves only some other definite or uncertain cognitions. Whether I feel my intestines or not, whether I have a feeling of certainty or of suspicion, this is all comparatively irrelevant to my mind so long as no effect is associated with these feelings. As soon as an effect is added, it immediately dominates the whole mind. It would carry us too far to attempt an enumeration of all the modes of action of affectivity. I should like to cite here only a few that are practically important. Let us take the reaction of an amoeba, quite independently of the question whether its functions are accompanied by consciousness or not. Accompanied by consciousness or not. The stimulus of a particle of food acts upon a certain definite spot of its body, a pseudopodium is sent out, which surrounds the food, digests it, throws out the indigestible part, and again the amoeba takes its original form. That would be the localized objective intellectual process. But the nutritional tonus and the entire condition of the amoeba must also have changed. During the seizure of the food, other parts of the body should not reach out in other directions, and such efforts had to be inhibited. The taking of food benefits the whole individual. It grows stronger, becomes more prone to fission and to carry out other similar functions, and the general mobility of the granules become livelier, etc. These general reactions of the amoeba might be compared to affectivity. Naturally, such general reactions accompany not only the act of seizure and digestion of the food, but as in the higher animals, they must begin when the food stuffs became noticeable during the act of perception, if we dare use here a term which assumes the existence of consciousness. In man, numerous physical phenomena are associated with an effect: conditions of hurt, vasomotors, muscle tonus, metabolism, tear glands, intestinal glands, sweat glands, the entire involuntary musculature, etc. Much more important, however, are the psychical accompaniments. An effect generalizes a reaction, or we may express it quite as correctly by saying an effect is a generalized reaction. Let me repeat that. An effect is a generalized reaction. A prick in my finger causes me to withdraw the hand. If I am frightened by it, I run away. If I become angry, then I attack. But it is not only the body which is influenced. If I am alarmed because the prick might remind me of a snake, then all considerations which might hinder my flight become more or less repressed, and the thought of avoiding danger becomes the dominant one. If I become angry, I might strike out even if it might not be the wisest thing to do. Yet, I am quite convinced at the time that I am warranted in so doing. Thus, in the presence of an effect, all opposing associations are inhibited, whereas thus in harmony with the affect are facilitated. The momentary force of all actions is thereby naturally increased, even when the actions are negative, such as a persistence in a given condition. It is easily understood that associations which do not harmonize with an affect cannot all be entirely suppressed. If they are of an indifferent nature, The effect is readily transferred to them. The place where something unpleasant has happened to us is hated. We often hate not only the one who does us an injury but also accidental bystanders, and this feeling might remain connected with them for a long time or forever. The carrier of a bad message is hated. Through this transference of the effect, irradiation, its influence upon actions naturally becomes further increased, and deviations from the course taken are opposed as much as possible. The effects have the further peculiarity of lasting longer than the actual experience. A pleasant experience tends to leave an agreeable mood for a long time. Addition: The Emotions and the Will by Alex Bain, 3rd edition, 1875. The influence of feeling on belief is of a mixed character. In the first place, it would arise in the ordinary action of the will. We are not easily persuaded of the ill effects of anything we like. In a state of strong excitement, no thoughts are allowed to present themselves except such as occur in the present mood, or feelings pervert or convictions by smiting us with intellectual blindness, which we need not be under even when committing great imprudence in action. It depends upon many circumstances what intensity of emotion shall be required to produce this higher effect of keeping utterly back the faintest recollection of whatever discords with the reigning fury. Anger often increases to fury some time after an unpleasant occurrence. Whoever has seen something worth striving for which has excited his effects will endeavor to gain it, even when the object has been removed, and the duration of his effort will have a definite and direct relation to the strength of the effects. In this way, affectivity determines perseverance in our actions. The hindrance to free judgment brought about by effects might often seem to be more disadvantageous than useful. Decisions made under the influence of emotion are rightly looked upon as questionable. For instance, one does many foolish things in anger, in despair, and in love, which he would not do under other circumstances. Even negative effects like fright and anxiety might render us defenseless to danger. These, however, are exceptions which are relatively very infrequent. Still, even these maximal effects, which often overstep the mark, might be at times of advantage, as is the case with the strength of desperation. The effects which are well adapted to our needs are those which occur constantly and which are of moderate degree. They are, as a rule, scarcely noticed. How often does a little impatience help us over a difficulty? An irritable tone of voice often suffices to get rid of disturbing persons. Children, who often do not know what danger is, would be lost as soon as they left their mother's arms if anxiety caused by unknown and indefinite perceptions did not keep them from harmful actions. And in important matters, too, it is our affectivity which overcomes the obstacles. Suppose we are facing a difficult undertaking. So long as we view it coldly, we cannot resolve to take hold of it. The obstacles seem to be too great. Too many considerations must be put aside. But when suddenly our enthusiasm is aroused for the task, then it seems to be the only thing worth working for. All other considerations are forgotten, or at any rate put aside. All mental and physical strength is set to work for the one object. Then and only then is it possible to gain what we desire. Affectivity, therefore, far more than reflection, is the determining element in our acts and omissions. Probably, we act exclusively under the influence of feelings of pleasure and displeasure. Our logical processes derive their dynamic force only from the effects combined with them. There are many people who know exactly what they should do, but who do nothing because they lack the proper effects. Our instincts, so far as we can observe them in ourselves, and we should not mix instincts with emotions or analyze them in lower animals, are associated with effects. All instincts are associated with effects. Hence the effects are connected not only with cognition but even more closely with volition. I might better say that affectivity is the broader conception wherein volition and desire represent only one side. Affectivity, which is one with our instincts and impulses, determines the direction of our endeavors. Logic judgment seems, on careful examination, to be only the servant that shows the way to the goal and furnishes the necessary apparatus. Harry Campbell says rightly that men preach what they think, but they do what they feel. Let me repeat that. Harry Campbell says rightly that men preach what they think, but they do what they feel. It is self-evident that the moral worth of a man depends entirely upon his moral feelings. He to whom the good does not appear beautiful and agreeable, who has no abhorrence of the bad, who lacks sympathy, will act badly, even if his logic, under special or general circumstances, surely warns him that it would be better for him to behave himself. Moral idiocy, moral idiot, or moral insanity, moral insane. On the whole, we are always striving for experiences accompanied by agreeable effects, and we avoid the opposite as much as possible. Conflicts often arise from the fact that the attainment of one pleasure often excludes the winning of another, that one of two evils must be chosen, that often that which is now agreeable will be disagreeable in the future. All these and other similar propositions are well-known commonplaces. Addition, in psychopathology, the affects in the vast majority of cases are the index of the whole picture, and it is easy to reduce the disorder to them, as, for instance, in melancholia and mania. In dementia praecox, where the affectivity is interfered with, There is a lack of effort, a failure to try to overcome obstacles, even when the intelligence is not much injured. It is remarkable how little attention has been paid to the mechanisms which allow us, through influence upon mental processes, to render affective experiences as pleasant or as little unpleasant as possible. The more intelligent and cultivated a man is, the less does he live in the present, and the more important do the past and future become. The past remains a part of our ego and forces us to come to an agreement with it. We rejoice over past happiness, grieve over the injustice we have suffered, and the evil things we have done torment us as remorse and force us to atone. The future rules us even more distinctly and more constantly. Anxiety and hope determine a great part of our present acts. They even go beyond the grave in the endeavor to secure a place in heaven. They go beyond the future when unselfish solicitude for thus we leave behind guides our acts. Generally speaking, however, we try to form for ourselves a future with as many comforts and as few discomforts as possible, and to this we devote the greater part of our energies. In pathological conditions and in dreams, anticipated feelings attain special significance, since in wish dreams and in wish deliria, which latter are frequent not alone in hysterical states, they present the fulfillment of desires. For example, a woman in love might dream or imagine in a delirium that she is the wife of her beloved. There are also wish hysterias, besides delirious conditions, which represent a fictitious wish fulfillment. The wish might then become fully realized. A prisoner, for example, under indictment, who is more or less clearly convinced that it would be well for him to be declared insane, might acquire a mental disorder, but a mental disorder as he understands it, or the so-called Ganser's complex. Addition: the influence of affectivity on the mechanism of the normal and abnormal mind has first been shown in its proper light by Freud. A very altruistic woman is fired with a desire for political progress. Neither her strength nor her circumstances allow her to carry out her ideals. Nevertheless, she must talk about them and become enthusiastic over them. The contrast between what she says and what she does, between her ideals and the realities, would render her ridiculous, but she would avoid this if she became ill. So on the occasion of an unhappy love affair, she acquires hysterical attacks, hysterical deliria, which naturally resist all treatment. Since a causal treatment, the removal of the above described conflict is not likely to be effected for a long time. This flight into disease is a very frequent cause of hysteria. A student in the gymnasium who would like to be among the best pupils is overwhelmed with work. If he should have a headache like his comrades A and B, The properly completed exercises might not be required of him. So he acquires a headache, but it is real and very unpleasant, and it only leaves him a short time after it has ceased to be useful to him. The father of a family suffers an injury in a railroad accident. How dreadful if he should no longer be able to provide for his family. At present he is doing fairly well, but such things can subsequently grow worse as well as better. And suppose he should have to go on with his occupation, half able to work and always in pain? After a late turn for the worse, no one would connect it with the injury. It would be better if he were dead or totally disabled. The lawyer tells him that his income, capitalized, would amount to 80,000 francs, and he could demand as much in case he were incapacitated. His family might thus be provided for permanently. Does not everything point to the fact that he will need to have this money? His sleep is already irregular. His work taxes him to the utmost. Pressure on the head appears. The railroad travel required by his business causes anxious dread, even anxious seizures. How very necessary it is to prove the existence of a severe disorder and obtain the 8,000 francs, etc. The traumatic neurosis or psychosis is now established and at best can only be cured after a favorable settlement of the suit. Addition. This flight into the disease has been very well described by Selma Hein in her novel Peter Paul, although in an individual who was not hysterical. All these wishes here referred to are naturally not clearly conscious to the individual. The mechanism of their realization is wholly outside of his knowledge. His acts are bona fide. We have now been drawn into a region to which we have dedicated a special chapter, that of suggestion or autosuggestion. The examples given leads us to anticipate this investigation and to say that feeling alone affect with its well-known sequelae and not some other particular mechanism fulfills the wish, realizes the autosuggestion. The past cannot be changed. The remembrance of it is often associated with very lively positive or negative effects. There are people who live on the remembrance of former happiness and are thereby happy. Anger due to injustice, remorse on account of wrong one had done. Pain due to some loss may embitter life for many years and outweigh actual sorrows. The means by which we seek to preserve the pleasant feelings of the past have been as yet little studied, even though Latin meminize juvabit, maybe this is French, I don't know, expresses an old truth. The past seems to be most easily revived by so arranging external conditions that memory is kept awake and all other impressions are avoided. Some persons who have lost someone dear to them to this by leaving the rooms and everything in them undisturbed in order that the past might continue to live in the memory. For the same reason, we revisit the scenes of former happiness, to revive the old feelings in spite of changed conditions. There may be other methods of a more psychological nature, but as yet we do not know them. Thanks to the investigations of Freud, we have learned a number of mechanisms which enable us to make painful feelings associated with past experiences as innocuous as possible. These mechanisms play an unexpectedly important role in hysteria, the obsessions, dementia praecox, and probably other disorders. It is shown most clearly in pathological cases that affectivity, as opposed to cognitive processes, has a certain independence that effects might separate themselves from some intellectual processes and connect themselves with others. It is well known that they may spread and that they may invade, as far as time and content are concerned, other mental experiences associated with a decided feeling tone. This disagreeable but transitory morning experience might spoil the mood of the whole day. The erotic effect, which originally concerns only the loved one, might be carried over to the rosette which she wears upon her breast, etc. Affectivity, moreover, shows its independence in regard to the intellectual processes in another way, for the same perceptions, the same experiences, can alter according to the intellectual, affective, even according to our bodily disposition. To the one who has just eaten, a meal tastes less pleasing than it does to a hungry man. When we are in an irritable mood, the music which we hear with pleasure under other circumstances annoys us. When we are tired, a lively play of colors, which would be otherwise very agreeable, awakens in us a feeling of displeasure. To be sure, there might be another explanation for this. The idea of a meal does not stand alone in our mind. The content of consciousness consists rather of a mass of individual factors, among which the condition of satiety or of non-satiety, satiety or of non-satiety is also an important one. Therefore, the mental content is not the same when we eat in a hungry state as when we eat already satiated. It is not at all unlikely that the emotional reaction is produced not only by the sight and taste of the food, but that it corresponds to the entire mental content at the time. If this hypothesis is correct, it is easily understood that the same effect cannot always correspond to the same individual partial sensations, because the effect corresponds in reality only to the whole mental content. Hence, we need not assume that our enjoyment of a beautiful painting is impaired by disagreeable surroundings. In our mind, the view of the picture and the environment are a whole with which the effect of pleasure is not associated. The pleasure of hearing a piece of music is then not an effect related to the music, but an effect called forth by the music, in association with our psychic and nervous disposition. We would react emotionally to the piece of music alone as little as we would under ordinary circumstances to the sight of a knife. But if the knife is in the hand of a suspicious-looking individual whom we meet in a lonely wood, the liveliest fright can be provoked. A sure indication of the independence of affectivity is the great variation in emotional reactions in different individuals to the same intellectual processes. The variation is so great that we really have no means of determining what is normal and what pathological. According to the ruling of German courts, complete defect of moral feeling, it est, the absence of an emotional tone, which would normally be associated with moral concepts, does not count as pathological unless it is accompanied by intellectual abnormalities. It is quite different with the intellectual processes, among which we must reckon the intellectual feelings, as already defined in this chapter. They are indeed somewhat more variable because more subjective than the primarily intellectual processes, sensation, perception, etc., but they may be compared to the logical faculties, which also show individual differences, or perceptions present within normal limits only very narrow variations, or logical reactions slightly greater ones. And where these functions are but little defective, the abnormal condition is at once perceived by the laity. When you have para-functions of these processes, hallucinations and delusions, they are, even when mild, quickly noticed as pathological, while as regards affectivity it is impossible in many instances to distinguish between para-function and normal function, since the same object might liberate in the one aesthetic feelings of a positive, in another of a negative character. Moreover, there is also very little relation between the distinctness of emotions and the distinctness of intellectual processes. Indeed, unclear processes, intellectual feelings, are very often accompanied by especially lively effects. The development of the intelligence, furthermore, is related in no single direction to the development of affectivity. Affectivity is fully developed in the young child. All the emotions of adult life, even the most complicated, are already present. The intelligence of a child, on the contrary, has no content, and the logical processes are relatively feeble. One who remains intellectually at the level of development of a child is an idiot, but one who has the affectivity of a child is not less well endowed with feelings than the normal man. The difference is that the feelings in the latter are not limited by the intelligence. Moreover, in adults, the liveliest feelings in the aesthetic sphere, for example, might be united with the greatest stupidity, and inversely, supranormal intelligence might be associated with the effect of the feelings. Morality, that is, the affective tone of moral concepts, is likewise wholly independent of the development of moral concepts themselves. Indeed, a certain intuitive morality, love, capability of self-sacrifice, etc., is often present in the lowest idiots, while the corresponding concepts are nearly or wholly lacking. These cases should be contrasted with moral idiocy, and might make it clear to those psychologists who, in spite of the fact that an independence of affectivity and intelligence is accepted in other spheres, are surprised that there is such a thing as moral idiocy. The independence of affectivity reaches so far that of effects, and especially moods, without intellectual substrata might develop directly from bodily feelings or physical conditions. Disease of the stomach might cause ill humor, valvular heart disease, anxiety, and tuberculosis of the lungs, euphoria, just as euphoria is produced by health of all the organs. The nerve poisons, especially alcohol, are used because of their definite actions on affectivity. As affectivity allows greater space for individual variations than do the intellectual functions, so also is the defense against unpleasant feelings very different in different persons and circumstances. We shall certainly come some day to the classification of a number of types, which shall represent more distinctly what was sought to be expressed by the old classification of temperaments. For the present, I can only allude to what I mean. Many individuals who resemble somewhat the classical sanguine type react quickly and intensely to emotional impressions, but the effect rapidly passes away. When the storm is over, they are the same as before. It is as if they exhausted the effect by their out-yard reactions, by the hurrying, weeping, scolding, or striking blows. If the effect be repressed against the natural disposition, it is likely to lead under conditions which as yet are not well defined to shuntings and conversions in the sense of Freud's pathological reaction. Subsequent unburdening, abreagieren, might then under certain circumstances cure the morbid symptom or symptoms which have been caused by a converted effect. Women and children seem to exhibit this type more frequently than men. Another group of individuals of easily excitable nature do not take a strong disagreeable effect into their whole personality. They dissociate the effect together with a large complex from their personality. They are entirely normal when they think of things having nothing to do with the effect and its associated intellectual processes. The effect does not exist for them, nor are the related ideational processes associated. A love affair which has turned out badly together with all the associations of the ego complex concerned with it may, so to speak, be cut out of the person. The effect is revealed chiefly in unconscious acts which betray a connection with the experiences of the love affair. A patient whose lover had shot himself forgot the occurrence, but in a casual conversation pressed rose leaves to her temple with a little snap, quite unconsciously. This could be demonstrated to be what Freud calls a symptomatic act. Symptomhandlung, German. Symptomhandlung. If, however, the affair or anything associated with it be mentioned, the effect is immediately revived and with it the remembrance of the whole story. It is evident that these types, when pronounced, are predisposed to hysterical deliria, since the dissociated affective personality often possesses too few associations related to actuality, and transforms the actual experiences in accord with the affective idea complex. In a third type, the effects develop slowly. They require a longer time to reach their maximum, but then but then remain long active. Lively expressions of feeling occur less often, the effect is repressed. Such individuals protect themselves from the influence of disagreeable effects by not thinking of the experience, which can only be successful by avoiding also, as far as possible, the associations related to the unpleasant occurrence. Thoughts and occupations are so arranged that, as far as possible, the disagreeable occurrences are not recollected and that undesirable memories shall be fleeting and not remain to be pondered over. Consequently, they have no time to revive the more slowly moving effect. Hence, the effect is suppressed, though it still remains, despite this, always ready and capable of association. The unpleasant experiences are likewise every moment accessible to memory. Remembrance is simply avoided, but is always possible at any instant. The intellectual feeling that certain thoughts must always be avoided, a sort of heaviness of heart, which gradually diminishes, proves the persistence of the repressed effect. If it again becomes actual through remembrance, it dominates the whole personality as at the time when it was new. A temporary, complete dissociation is also possible in this type, an unpleasant experience that cannot at the moment be gotten square with because of other duties and consequently cannot be disposed of, is dissociated, completely forgotten. While the other occupations continue, neither the feelings nor the occurrence exist in the consciousness. It is only later that it reemerges and has to be elaborated and disposed of. If suppression of the effect is wholly successful, so that it exists no longer for consciousness, it is often converted. Instead of the effect, some physical symptoms appear, a pain and hallucination, etc. A patient described by Ricklin had earache whenever she put on a certain jacket, a jacket which she had worn one winter day in the woods when she had given birth to an illegitimate child and at the time had contracted earache. The connection was completely unknown to her, the jacket reminding her neither of the birth nor of the effect. In dementia praecox, affective experiences are transformed into hallucinations, delusions, stereotypies, all generally having some obscure symbolism, while the original effect cannot be demonstrated or is rudimentary. See the works of Jung and Ricklin. There are doubtless many such mechanisms by which disagreeable effects are gotten rid of. A knowledge of them will make the symptomatology of the abnormal as well as of the normal mind more comprehensible, and at the same time will afford us some help for treatment. Among the emotional experiences which give rise to the phenomena we have described, sexual matters play a very important part, though perhaps they do not so completely dominate the symptomatology as one might believe from reading Freud's works. There are important reasons why women are more influenced thereby than men, aside from the stronger sexuality of women, which, however, has been unduly emphasized. In the average woman, her whole career depends on the sexuality. Her instinct of self-preservation makes use of the sexual instinct. Not in all cases. To her, marriage means that which to a man means success in business, ambition in all directions, a well-conducted struggle for existence, enjoyment of life, in addition to sexual pleasures and the joy in children. That which to the average man appears to be relatively or absolutely unimportant, not to marry or illegitimate sexual indulgence, has for women far-reaching results marked by the strongest effects, and the foolish restrictions of our culture make even the thought of these questions impossible to a well-bred woman, requiring not only the suppression of all acts in that direction but the suppression of the sexual effect itself. It is no wonder that under these circumstances one meets in woman patients at every turn converted, repressed, displaced sexual feelings. Those feelings which make up at least half of our natural existence. I say at least half, for the analogous instinct, hunger, seems to retreat before the sexual, and this is true, not in the case of civilized men only, for whom in the majority of instances the struggle for food is either unnecessary or comes into play in a very indirect manner. One of the most important manifestations of affectivity is attention. We are attentive to processes or things which interest us. Furthermore, we can force the attention to turn to other things, but we always have an affective basis for so doing. In such event, it is an indirect satisfaction of an interest, as when I read a tiresome book, which it is necessary to do in connection with my work, which interests me, or when I give myself up to a psychological experiment, the results of which are to satisfy my desire for knowledge, or when in order to keep away discomfort or to gain comforts we perform tiresome labors for food or money, or when one works to avoid punishments, as in the case of a slave or a convict. Therefore, a personal and actual interest lies at the basis of a passive attention, while an indirect interest, with an effect similar to that of fear and hope, lies at the basis of active attention. Naturally, all effects which are not here named can dominate the attention. Thus cited are only those which are most frequent in daily life. Everything which excites an effect, anxiety, fear, joy, love, attracts our attention to it. Addition: by sexuality is understood not only coitus, the sexual act itself, but above all the many effects which are connected with sexuality. This latter often play a more important part with women than sexuality in the limited sense. I know a woman who was very neurasthenic, and who certainly suffered from unsatisfied desire for love. She married, became markedly better, and is now perfectly happy, although coitus has never been successful. Stransky rightly says attention equals interest, which latter corresponds to feeling and is a part of affectivity. There are whole volumes of pedagogic wisdom in the simple formula: the attention of a child can be turned to and really grasp an object only if The teacher can bring it into connection with some idea associated with a strong effect. So, everything which excites an effect, anxiety, fear, joy, love, attracts our attention to it. What we know of attention is the fact that it causes all these perceptions, associations, and movements which are related to an object of interest to be stimulated, all opposing ones to be inhibited. This we already know as the action of affects. When I turn my attention to the problem of attention, all the associations belonging to it are facilitated. Each portion of the problem has its own particular interest. At first, my attention was turned to the effects which aroused the attention. Now it is turned to the associative changes which attention creates. All these particular associations are facilitated, all others inhibited. Without this direction of the thoughts by interest, by the aim of my work, I could just as well have passed from this idea of the associations to the work of Jung and Ricklin than to that of Aschaffenburg, then to the cathedral at Cologne, etc. These last ideas would never have appeared in consciousness while writing this if I had not needed an example of the kind of associations which are ordinarily inhibited under these circumstances. I have here made such a series of associations for the first time, despite the fact that I have been occupied with the problems of attention and associations for years past. But such a series is closely related to free association, also to flight of ideas. We come now to that which Paulin years ago designated by the name of loi de la finalité. Loi de la finalité, by which he meant that the ordinary laws of association did not suffice to explain the train of thought if the purpose or ultimate aim of the train of thought were not also reckoned with as a definite factor. For us, it suffices to know that attention, as well as our whole conduct, is always directed by effects, or better expressed, attention is one side of affectivity which does nothing else, as we already know, but facilitates certain associations and inhibit others. For us, it suffices to know that attention is, as well as our whole conduct, is always directed by affects, or better expressed, attention is one side of affectivity which does nothing else, as we already know, but facilitates certain associations and inhibit others. In the process of facilitation, we naturally have to consider not only the intracentral and centripetal, but also a mass of centrifugal connections. The readiness of the senses, the adjustment of the eye, for example, or the readiness of the muscles for action in harmony with the effects should not be forgotten. When a cat fixes its attention on a mouse hole, it is always in readiness to seize the prey, as is shown by its position and the relative tension of all the muscles. When we say that anxiety makes us ready for fight or defense, it is the same as saying that we have turned our attention to the object of anxiety and to the accompanying reactions. The well-known theory regarding the origin of melancholic delusions can be described as well in terms of the effect as in terms of attention. It has been said that in states of depression, only depressive ideas can be associated, while others are inhibited. One might equally well say that the attention being fixed upon sorrowful ideas, no others can come into consciousness. The process is the same as when an investigator puts forward a false theory and then spends the rest of his life in finding support for it, meanwhile overlooking all opposing evidence. His attention is given only to the former. He has interest only in observations that help his cause. Attention is therefore nothing more than a special kind of affective action. As the forms of affectivity change, so do those of attention. In the organic psychosis, the effects are fleeting. It is the same with attention. The manic patient colors everything that occurs to him with his constantly predominant positive feeling tone. He is therefore interested in everything, in trivialities, as well as in the important things. This leveling of ideas necessarily causes distractibility by external happenings. A further consequence is the flight of ideas. Thus, I would not say that other causes might not contribute to the genesis of this symptom. In dementia praecox, the effects are more or less repressed. Interest is often entirely lacking, and attention is also lacking. The flow of ideas is without direction. The ideas are connected with any given idea in a very bizarre manner and without selection. These allusions might suffice to illustrate the meaning of our conception for psychopathology. I do not think that we express views with which all our colleagues are familiar. More popular at present than this associative conception of attention is a dynamic theory which sees in a concentration of cerebral or mental forces, or even in a greater exertion of them, the essential nature of attention. This interpretation often starts from the feelings of fatigue. At present, we can do anything with the latter in a psychological analysis, for we are entirely ignorant of their origin. It is possible that even in purely mental exertion of the attention, the never failing tension of certain muscle groups, eye muscles, muscles the forehead, plays a definite role. Again, on the other hand, we know that the feelings of physical fatigue may be easily dissipated by effects and other influences. Feres evres motrice. Therefore, we can not make use of fatigue in our theoretical consideration. On the other hand, we must also affirm that in spite of Fechner, we have no means of measuring the intensity of mental processes. All that we know at present about them is reducible to association mechanisms. Only affectivity and its expressions appear to us to have intensity and are matters of quantity. But while we may estimate its strength, we cannot measure it and do not know at all upon what it depends. There is as yet, therefore, no possibility of establishing such dynamic theories, and also little ground for seeking them. A better knowledge of the physiological basis of our mental life will someday certainly bring the dynamic factor into discussion. According to many writers, the feelings are our most individual and fundamental possession, and they, not the intellectual presentations, hold the ego together. This is going too far. To our ego belongs all that we experience and consciously or unconsciously register, including the intellectual as well as the affective processes. Among the former, the organic feelings are held with a certain amount of truth to be preeminent as the foundation of our ego, even though we are usually not conscious of them. In this connection, it is said that the feelings are developed earlier than the intelligence. Addition, how premature this dynamic theory is plainly seen in the theories which attempt to explain the differences between ideas and sensations or perceptions. Many assume, tacitly or explicitly, a greater intensity of sensation without having a shadow of proof. To be consistent, we would then also have to assume that hallucinations differ from ideas by their greater intensity. Another addition. This is naturally something entirely different from saying that our characters and our actions are almost exclusively dominated by affectivity. So, in this connection, it is said that the feelings are developed earlier than the intelligence. This is undoubtedly true in part, but I believe that we can express it better in another way. The empty intelligence, the capacity of combining the memory pictures of our experiences so as to correspond to actual experiences, must naturally be already formed at birth, for the acquisition of a world picture depends upon the analogy associations, just as does our logic. What the child lacks, however, is experience. It has the same power of association as the adult, but on account of its inadequate experience, it has too little material for association and too few analogies to afford direction in any given case. Affectivity needs no content, no material from without. Experience only furnishes the occasion for the production of an effect. Both functions, considered in the abstract, are therefore developed and ready at birth. But intelligence, in order to express itself, must collect material through experience, whereas affectivity needs no foreign material to immediately express itself in all its complications and specializations. The sexual sphere naturally accepted. What we ordinarily call highly specialized affectivity, due to high development of character and to education, etc., is the affective side of a highly developed and complete intelligence. Thus, we see in children the most complicated emotional reactions already present at a time when the content of the intelligence is ridiculously insignificant. Affectivity directs the associations in a definite manner at a time when there is no chance for experience to enter. We see this in the frequent striking intuitive comprehensions of complicated situations and the yet more striking correct reactions to them. When my little boy of 5 months first stood on his own feet, he was so proud of it and started around so like a rooster that both his parents burst into laughter. But this presently caused him to burst out crying with a distinct attitude of annoyance. He could not endure the laughter at his new accomplishment. Anyone who was not present and had not studied the whole reaction of the boy before and after would naturally have been prone to believe, as I was myself at first, that it was something else and that I had imagined the pride and anger. But I was as skeptical as possible in this matter, and daily observation of the child, until He was old enough to express himself about his feelings, admitted of no other conclusion. Some further examples will make the matter clearer. When he was 11 months old, he desired to be helped up one day as he sat on the floor. I refused, with the remark that he had wet the floor. Then he assumed a determined and superior expression, lifted himself slowly from the floor, and looked around with a lordly air that plainly said, "If you will not help me, I know how to help myself." When he was a little more than a year old, on one occasion, he would not obey, whereupon I said to him, "While you are so little, Papa is still master." Thereupon the little fellow, who could scarcely speak a half dozen words, threw his head back, and rocking his head and trunk back and forth, as if he were going to bawl in an affected manner, he repeated several times, with a scornful, ironical voice, "Papa, Papa, Papa." This was done in a mockingly respectful tone that no actor could have surpassed, just as if he wanted to mock me as a bolster. On another occasion, he accidentally said, "Mama is cross," and as soon as he noticed the mistake, he reduced it ad absurdum by designating everyone present as cross, including himself. When he was 31 months old, he did something naughty, whereupon I told him he must go into a room and stay alone as punishment. Without a reflection, he at once asked, "Is pussy there too?" In this case, the apparent diplomacy with which he knew how to take the sting out of the punishment was astonishing. It would certainly be incorrect to see for some kind of reasoning or intellectual process behind this. The situation brought a certain defiance into action, and not wishing to offend me, the effect instinctively brought forward the corresponding reaction, the correct association. Still more complicated is the reaction in the following case, which has been described to me by a competent observer. The little one was about 2 years old when a new baby sister arrived. The bedding was displaced on one occasion by the convulsive cawing of the mother, who gave her husband a sign without speaking of the accident because she knew the little one was watching her. While the father set the things in order again, the boy turned his back to the bed and busied himself with nothing, exactly like a waiter in the reception room for travelers, who has nothing to do but wait for orders and be on the lookout. As soon as the clothing was put to rights, the boy again regained his natural manner. It was as if he had noticed nothing. Some days later, he received a reproof from his mother because he had wet his clothes. The answer was, "Mama too, Mama too, Mama koch too." The latter sentence was repeated several times in the next few minutes. It is clear that the child at once apprehended through his feelings and not by means of conscious intelligence that there was something in the situation to be concealed, something that it would be well not to notice or to appear to have noticed. He reacted to the situation as well as an intelligent adult with conscious reasoning powers could have done. But he had also understood that something had occurred, similar to the occasion when he was laid in a dry bed, and as he had been reproved, he could not repress the excuse that his mother had also done the same thing. He dared not speak directly of the delicate affair, and so his instinct use a substitution and name the coughing instead of the disorder in bed, with its cause and accompanying conditions. He struck at the sack and meant the ass. From an intellectual standpoint, it was not exactly wise, for he taught his secret, and if he had not been understood, his whole defense would have been worthless. But this defect proves how small a part that which we call intellect played in the matter. This example shows very well what kind of basis or common speech has when it talks of feeling situations in an attempt at expressing the fact that we do not know a thing but only feel it. In such cases, it is the affectivity that guides the associations. In reality, it is not a question of cognition but simply of an instinctive reaction which hits the mark. The partly external but in some respects also essential resemblance to some of our medical diagnoses, which we make by feeling or intuition, as it were, is obvious, even though in this case unconscious observations and conclusions are essential, while the affectivity is more in the background. We now come to the question of the relation of instincts to effects. We cannot exhaust the subject here, and a few references must suffice. There is only one instinct in man that is in some degree clearly defined, the sexual instinct. All others are hidden by our complicated conditions. The desire for food impels us to a great variety of actions, which accomplish their object in a very indirect way. Even the thrashings received at school are supposed to be useful for us later in the fight for existence. Then we do not directly acquire food but money, which might also be used for other objects. Moreover, we may live without concerning ourselves with our instinct for getting food. The man living on his income, as well as the tramp in the almshouse, does nothing toward obtaining food, and the insane are often fed artificially against their will, etc. The sexual instinct, however, appears to be still fairly primitive and unchanged. Here we see how, through pleasure in certain actions, we are voluntarily or involuntarily driven to do that which ensures the preservation of the species. In this also nature acts in an indirect way. All kinds of flirting, the choosing of a cravat or of a ball dress, all conduce to the one end, even if nature's aim therein is usually unknown and would be violently denied. The essential feature in this human instinct is, therefore, that the correlated actions in certain sequences and under certain conditions are associated with a pleasant emotional tone and are hence sought after. We see the same where the nutrition impulse is directly satisfied by eating and drinking, and in the case of the mother, nursing the child. The eater and the nursing mother also have pleasure in the act. We might suppose that the same conditions exist in the simple as well as in the complicated instincts of the lower animals. Indeed, when we compare the emotional expressions of animals with ours, we must perforce assume the like conditions. The building of a nest, for example, is doubtless accompanied by an agreeable feeling tone. Nevertheless, the instincts have also an intellectual component. It does not suffice that certain actions, if carried out, should appear agreeable. there must also be in the nervous system an impelling force to perform the actions. Otherwise, we should only accidentally follow an instinct, as is sometimes the case, to be sure, with the human sexual impulse. The dominating position of affectivity, as well as its marked independence of intellectual processes, is best shown in pathological conditions. It seems this domain to be altogether an elementary attribute of the mind, dominating the whole picture of the disease, altering the intellect as it may require, and suffering least damage in the pathological processes. In the most severe brain diseases, the feelings are not destroyed. On the contrary, their influence upon the damaged intellectual processes is stronger than under normal conditions. To be sure, the opposite is stated in most textbooks of psychiatry. Kraepelin, for example, says that in senile dementia, the feelings are also blunted, that the patient becomes apathetic and indifferent, that the loss of near relatives and similar occurrences pass over him without making a lasting impression, and that the patient becomes indifferent to his family, profession, and his favorite avocation. This interpretation seems to me to be incorrect, accurate, as are the observations. What we are dealing with is a secondary disturbance of affectivity. Affectivity as such is preserved. As soon as we succeed in making the ideas mentioned above sufficiently clear to a patient with organic brain disease, we see the feelings reappear and the reactions correspond qualitatively to those of a normal person. Whenever it is possible for the patient to conceive in some measure the relation of his profession or of his family to himself, the emotional reaction never fails to appear. If he compares if he compares the present with the past, he will generally moan and weep. If his earlier accomplishments or the good circumstances of his family come to the foreground, we note feelings of pride and contentment. It is the same with the moral depravity, insanity, of the senile or general paralytic. It is not based upon anomaly of the feelings. These patients indeed commit all sorts of offenses against propriety and property. The defect, however, lies in the intellectual sphere, and where the feelings come into play, their influence on the flow of thought is even greater than in the normal, and there is no lack of emotional reaction. Take, for example, an old man who has violated children. Ordinarily, he speaks of his offense with indifference and seems to be blunted in his moral sense. But the fact is that the comprehension or the conception of the criminality of his deed is wanting. Of course, the actual remembrance of the occurrence is not apt to be absent, but in this thought alone there is no basis for a negative emotional tone. When an Oriental marries an immature maiden and has intercourse with her, he has no scruples and indeed cannot understand why such should exist. In such matters, the relation of the deed to all our social and sexual ideas and customs must be taken into consideration. Only a more or less conscious presentation of these numerous associations can give rise to a negative feeling tone, abhorrence for the act, or remorse, if the sexual feelings as such can be aroused as well by a child as by a mature woman. That the difference between a child and a woman is not always made by those suffering from an organic psychosis must, after all, be due to a disturbance of the associations, a disorder of the concept in its widest sense, whereby only one characteristic of the person is recognized, the femininity and not the youth. Now, if we succeed in making clear to the seemingly different patient the real nature of his offense with its significance to society and to his unfortunate victim, the feelings of abhorrence and remorse arise in him as they would have done when he was in a normal condition. The experiment can naturally not be made in all cases, but it is generally possible to obtain from such patients affective reactions to the simpler ethical ideas. And to do this, it is only necessary to bring before the patient the particular idea concerned together with all its necessary components. For example, the affection for the family, which might apparently be wholly lacking, might often be well demonstrated before a large audience of students. What is pathological in the organic psychosis, so far as the feelings are concerned, is that they dominate the thoughts more strongly than in healthy individuals. Their inhibitory and helping influence on associations is rendered stronger by the faultiness of intellectual function. In other words, the senile or general paralytic can ordinarily think of that only which is correlated with his effect, with his impulse. When his sexuality is aroused, he sees in the little girl only the female that can satisfy his desire. Opposing associations often fail completely or are limited to the taking of a few foolish precautionary measures. When a general paralytic hangs around some object on the yard which seems to him desirable and then suddenly hides it under his clothes in the sight of a dozen witnesses, he gives no thought to the witnesses, and quite as little to the moral depravity of the theft. He wanted one thing, and therefore he took it, but under other circumstances he may detest a theft, namely, when he can represent to himself the crime as such. The general paralytic of Krepelin, who jumped from a third-story window to get a cigar stump, thought only of gaining the valuable object, but not of the danger, of the hate, of the fall, etc. One sees the same thing in simple association experiments. The association of such patients are dominated by effects to a greater degree than under normal conditions. Another pathological manifestation of affectivity in patients with organic brain disease is its diminished durability. We are wont to speak of the superficiality of their feelings. They may change from one moment to another if a variety of different ideas can be brought before them. It is frequently possible to get a paralytic to laugh, cry, and laugh again in the same minute. Such patients come to appear childish, and indeed we speak of second childhood in the aged. Therefore, affectivity as such is retained in the organic psychosis. The reactions of the emotions are proportionate to the intellectual reactions. On the other hand, they are excited too easily and have little persistence. The blunting of the feelings is secondary and rests on the fact that concepts cannot be perfectly apprehended, so that no corresponding emotional reaction can be aroused. Moreover, the affectivity dominates the associations much more than in normal individuals. Similar conditions are found in alcoholism. It is on the whole incorrect to say that the feelings of the chronic alcoholic are dulled. He is on the contrary ruled by his affectivity, by his feelings. When he treats his family badly and neglects his business, there is always a positive cause for it. He has other interests which so occupy him and whose accompanying effects so dominate him that he forgets every other consideration. In his outbursts of affection, in his moments of repentance, every ordinary alcoholic shows hundreds of times that he still has feelings for his family. If he is confined in an asylum, he might write his ill treated wife the most beautiful, heartfelt letters and shower her with words of affection. This makes the alcoholic so dangerous. With real conviction and actual emotion, he will make the most beautiful promises, will manifest the greatest affection, so that as a rule the wife who has been deceived 100 times allows her to be deceived the 101st. The alcoholic will coram publico break into floods of tears when the frost threatens the crop of a neighbor, while at the same time he allows his own property to go to ruin and maltreats his wife and children. In company where only words and feelings and not deeds are required of him, he may rightly pass for a man of good instincts and beautiful enthusiasm, no matter how meanly he may conduct himself at home with his family. There is no dulling of the feelings in him, but they are too easily excited and too fleeting. They are lacking in him perseverance and the power to resist temptation. Temptation overcomes him in the same way that a moment before another feeling had dominated him. That so little good and so much bad is produced by these changeable feelings is easily explained by the fact that to accomplish anything good requires persistence and perseverance, whereas a foolish or a mean thing might be done quickly. We don't see anything strikingly good in it when a drinker, on his return home in a more or less cheerful mood, is affectionate to his wife, but we naturally consider his actions in every way reprehensible if a moment later, excited by some repugnance on her part, he is brutal to her. Unfortunately, he may be credited with virtue by casual hearers if, at some patriotic banquet, he delivers a deeply felt address, which, however, he is wholly unable to live up to. The affectivity of the alcoholic is not reduced but increased. All the emotions can be aroused in him and more easily than in normal individual, but they lack durability. The alcoholic suffers, as do the organic cases, only from emotional incontinence. A certain contrast to this is afforded by the affectivity of the epileptic. Here also, in spite of their notorious egoism, no effect is wanting which belongs to the normal individual. So far as there is actual limitation of effects, it is due to the limitation of the associations. The effects are moreover easily called forth, but they have a certain persistence, although this is not the persistence needed for productive occupation, but a persistence which does not let the effect subside in a natural way. Anger or rage, for example. The effects of the epileptic are not labile in the sense that they may rapidly replace one another as in organic psychosis and alcoholism. The perseveration shows itself also in effects. In idiocy, too, the effects are not really defective. At any rate, they are possible within very wide limits. emotivity, and apathy occur more frequently and in a higher degree than in normal individuals. But this is not more pronounced than in intelligent psychopaths, and I am not aware of any positive evidence that defects of individual emotions, such as moral feeling, are more frequent in idiots and imbeciles than in intelligent people. But naturally, idiots can form no emotions in connection with ideas, which they do not have. This is not a defect of the feelings, but an intellectual defect, while its influence on the feelings is not abnormal. Thus, we see affectivity developed and persisting even where intelligence in the narrow sense is not developed or is destroyed. It persists as long as the most simple objective processes, the sensations and simple cognitions, in individual cases even longer. Cases of senile dementia and general paralysis still have decided emotions when perception and sensation are markedly disordered, and yet there is a disease in which the suppression of the emotions might be said to occupy the foreground of the picture, dementia praecox. In this disorder, the anatomical changes in the brain are so slight that it has not yet been possible to define them. The intelligence is not destroyed, but only suppressed, as is evidenced by certain temporary or permanent improvements and late recoveries. The affectivity, however, in the majority of cases is hopelessly defective. It is not conceivable that such an elementary function can be simply blotted out of the brain by a minute pathological process. Therefore, the question is, what has become of the effects in dementia praecox? The question is answerable, and I hope that the work of my colleague Jung will in the near future be so far along as to afford us at least a glimpse of the mechanisms which remove the effects from our observation. We shall deal with paranoia only, whose genesis to many alienists is related to abnormal effects, and we shall further on devote a special chapter to it. What affectivity is, we cannot say, but for our purposes, this is only an academical question. It is sufficient for us to know that intellectual processes, psychopetal and intrapsychic association complexes, not only cause the special respective reactions, but also so dominate the associations of the entire nervous system, including the vasomotor and splanchnic nerves, that a general reaction occurs which gives support to the special reactions and, apart from exceptional conditions to which the organism is not adapted, contributes to the general advance of the individual. Nevertheless, there are certain questions in this connection which I should like to touch upon briefly. Is feeling or affectivity in our sense of the term a property of sensory perception? Sehen. Is it contained in sensory perception? Wund. Or is it an independent parallel process of consciousness? Quell. When we understand clearly that the centripetal stimulus produces both the sensory perception and the feeling, but that with the same sensory perception the feeling might vary, it seems as if everything necessary were said. The question is evidently one of terms. That is to say, it depends on whether we wish to include the accompanying feeling in the concept of sensory perception or not. I would much rather combine affectivity and volition into one comprehensive unity, for affectivity is much more closely connected with desires, instincts, and will than with intellectual processes, It is scarcely possible, even theoretically, to separate the two psychic functions from each other. It is almost as if effects and desire were one, and as if with these words we had only theoretically isolated two different sides of one process. I cannot believe in an independent will function, nor indeed in a faculty of volition, since pathology is not aware of simple diseases of will. Is feeling effect the sum of all changes produced by the intellectual process? Lange. Possibly, and I think very probably, but in relation to this, we must consider not only the physical but also the psychical symptoms, the inhibitions and facilitations. At any rate, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure seems to me to be the essential feature of the effects, and one might put the question thus: is there a special process in the brain which is the substratum of pleasure and displeasure, or do the associative, the vasomotor, and the secretory inhibitions and facilitations together make up the feeling of pleasure? This question is as yet not answerable. For the time being, therefore, it seems to me a matter of indifference whether we say an intellectual process is the cause of the effect or it contains it, just as it might be the same whether we say an effect causes symptoms such as palpitations of the heart or palpitations of the heart is a component of an effect or an effect is the sum total of all symptoms ascribed to it. The theory is that various cell conditions have to do with the feelings of pleasure and displeasure, Maynard, I pass over as being entirely in the air. Of greater interest is the question whether the various effects are differences in degree or whether they are qualitatively different or otherwise expressed, whether they are of one or many dimensions. If they were due to differences in the degree, the qualitative difference would have to be sought in the accompanying intellectual processes. Unfortunately, this question also cannot be answered with certainty. Indeed, we do not as yet know whether the simple feelings of pleasure and displeasure are something quite different from effects in a narrower sense, such as hate, anger, etc. They might perhaps be partial manifestations of effects which necessarily accompany them. To me, the feeling caused by the sight of a beautiful picture and that caused by eating a good beef steak seem to be very different. Others have tried to explain complicated effects as mixed conditions of pleasure and displeasure, but it does not seem that they have succeeded in proving this view. We must reject the conception of Wundt that effects are three-dimensional. Feelings of tension and relaxation and of excitation and depression are preeminently inner cognitions, not feelings in our sense. Tension and relaxation, excitation and depression might be part of an effect, and their cognition might be associated with pleasantness and unpleasantness, as are other intellectual processes. If there be anything of truth in this dimensional theory, it is insufficiently or not all expressed in Wundt's formulation. Lip's three-dimension theory seems to me to be even less well-founded. Suggestion. Suggestion seems in certain respects to resemble the intellectual feelings of Nachlovsky. To believe, to doubt, to guess, to regard as certain, to convince one's self on the one hand, and to accept a suggestion on the other hand, all this express in the same sense the intellectual reaction of our ego to some idea. And yet, there's a very important difference between suggestion and the other processes cited. Suggestion goes much further. To believe, to convince oneself, and all these reactions are not able to influence bodily functions, to produce hallucinations, or to so dominate the logic that the grossest nonsense is accepted against all evidence. To be sure, the supposition of a danger might produce bodily manifestations, but in an indirect way, through the anxiety which it produces. Belief causes constantly the acception of illogical thoughts and sometimes the appearance of hallucinations, but when this is the case, an effect or suggestion also play a part, and indeed, belief is scarcely ever free from the action of suggestion. Take the case of religion and politics. In such cases, therefore, the results which go beyond the intellectual sphere are not direct consequences of the intellectual feelings. Suggestion, however, produces all this directly. It controls the functions of the glands, of the heart, of the vasomotor system, of the intestines. It disassociates certain idea complexes from those which are contradictory. It shuts out criticism, rules the senses, so that it may readily create illusions and also positive and negative hallucinations. As we have seen, exactly the same result might be brought about by the effects, the objective actions of suggestion, and therefore the same as those of the affectivity, but different from this of the intellectual processes. The kind of action, as far as we know anything of it, is also the same. We know that the affective accompaniment of a thought favors the associations which correspond to the effect but renders others more difficult or inhibits them. In this way, the acceptance of a thought is favored. Critical judgment, however, is rendered impossible, exactly the same as in the case of a suggestive idea. If we seek the basis of suggestion, we meet similar conditions. We are unable to explain it through intellectual processes, but on the other hand, we note the close relationship with what we find in the action of effects. Bernheim, however, derives suggestion from credulity, crédivité on French, which everyone possesses, very likely displays a certain not unimportant role in intellectual suggestions, particularly those communicated by speech, which are the most frequent among human beings. But the power of suggestion is not to be explained on this basis. We will omit a criticism of the numerous theories and explanations of suggestion, but refer only to one of the newest, that of Stern. According to Stern, Psychologie der Aussage, passive suggestion is a simple mental attitude. This conception is insufficient because the same may be said of an ordinary belief. If I, with Stern, say, "Here is a table," and the hearer believes that a table stands here although in reality none does, this is not yet suggestion. If the possibility of control is excluded, it is simply a question of belief. If the hearer can see the place where the suggested table should stand, then he must either reject the suggestion or hallucinate a table. The belief in these cases is entirely a subordinate matter. The essential thing is the hallucination, a much more profound interference. Again, if Stern designates suggestion as an imitation of mental attitude, he includes too much in the idea, for all belief is such an imitation. Nevertheless, it is interesting that Stern, with the idea of imitation, or as he has more accurately expressed it, with the assumption of the mental attitude of another with the appearance of our own attitude, comes very near our own conception. Quite useless are such theories as that of Lipps, which takes only the extremes into consideration, or the similar one of Helpak, Helpach, Psychologie der Hysterie, which assumes as the criterion of all psychical consequences which can be called suggestion, their senselessness and exaggerated character. Let's take an ordinary case. A mother tells her child that the porridge is hot. The child has already gained an idea of hot, but in spite of the warning, he tries to eat the porridge and burns his mouth. In a million cases, that which is said to him will be verified by his own experience. The child must therefore, by analogy, learn to regard what his parents, his teacher, tell him as, in the main, correct, even when individual experiences are lacking. This kind of belief or credulity is a peculiarity of all men and is a conditio sine qua non for any educability. If one regards only the intellectual processes, such an action of credulity might be conceived as a suggestion. One accepts something as the truth without proof or examination simply on the assurance of some other person. I would prefer not to extend the conception of suggestion so far. When the parents in the same tone say something to the child that his perceptions or later his logical understanding contradicts, it is no longer believed. Perception and logic hold their own in spite of the assertion. Just as little can simple credulity influence the movements of the heart or intestines or the glandular secretion, or in the psychical sphere, dissociate a part of the personality and make it independent, as it were. The influence of credulity is therefore not so far reaching as that of suggestion. The peculiarity of the latter we see most clearly in simple conditions. Among all animals living together, suggestion plays a great role. If one of a herd is attacked, the danger threatens all the others, or at least it would be better for them to take part in defense or flight. If food is to be found somewhere, it is well if the whole herd know of it. Therefore, the individual animals show their effect as soon as they scent danger of food. Immediately the same effect, with the same expression, and with the same movements of defense, flight, or acceptance, is communicated to the whole herd, so far as they can perceive through their senses the effect of their compassions. In this, there need be absolutely no intellectual content present. What is suggested is only the effect, the anxiety, the desire to fight, the pleasure of the chase. In the case of man, it is presupposed that the suggester can suggest an effect which he himself does not have. But one can not compare the complicated experimental conditions with the natural functions of the mind and can only cautiously draw conclusions from one to the other. Speech and artificial training allow the use of means, of which there can be no question in the case of animals under natural conditions. We must always remember that the suggestion of an effect to a person who is not trained to absolute obedience can scarcely succeed if the suggester does not, in his tone at least, simulate something of the effect. It is just as little possible to suggest sleep by giving the words in a merry tone. One must either speak monotonously or commandingly in the suggestions which move the world. The effects of the suggestors and of the suggested are moving elements. There are also conditions in man and animals in which one effect in one person calls out the opposing effect in another, without our having to assume an intellectual process with a secondary effect. The anxiety of the opponent awakens the courage of the aggressor, and vice versa. We have no reason to think that in such cases another mechanism comes into action. Let me just say something about this book, that this is very strongly correlated with pornography, for example. We continue. In higher animals, we must also assume that the place and kind of danger or beauty is communicated at the same time, but the essential thing can only be the transmission of the effect. The communication of the content, the intellectual part, must play a secondary role. This we see in the dog, for example, an animal which has retained very little of the herd instinct but which is very accessible for suggestion from other dogs. The barking of one awakens similar, it est, affectively similar barking in the whole neighborhood, and yet we stand near enough to those highly developed companions of man to be able, from our observations, to conclude that they can make no accurate communication in that way. We find suggestion in animals only in the case of effects or occurrences associated with effects, and we have good grounds for concluding that the animals, the highest classes of certain genera, perhaps accepted, communicate only occurrences associated with effects, or we might say in reality only effects. That animals communicate experiences to each other which have no affective meaning for them will be maintained by no one. Indeed, it scarcely occurs among men. Or complicated relations conceal the effect component, which depends on some distant association. The teacher instills grammar into his students because his living depends on it. He serves his nutrition instinct with its effects. The description of a flower is given on account of its botanical interest, etc. Many call the blind following of the sheep by the other sheep suggestion. It might appear that we are dealing in that case essentially with an intellectual suggestion, for we see nothing of affect in it, but we do not know the instinct which causes this behavior. Occasionally, they follow some passerby for hours and cannot be driven back by blows. Kittens sometimes also show the same phenomenon. Chicks who have just hatched follow not only the brood hen, but also the first moving object or being which they meet. These analogies make it very probable that following the leader, in the case of the sheep, has little or nothing to do with suggestion in contradistinction to what we find in man. The communication or the description of the cause of the effect, in other words, of the intellectual part is probably as a rule unnecessary, at any rate of less importance. Sometimes it is implicitly contained in the original expression of the effects, that is, the direction of flight or the movement of an attack. After the foregoing, the purpose of suggestibility does not especially need to be further detailed. It causes the whole community to be ruled at the same time by the same effect. It causes the necessary unity of action. It suppresses all other endeavors of single individuals so that the energy of the actions is increased. It gives greater perseverance to the effect and then to the efforts which we make, because the individual whose efforts threaten to weaken is again turned to the original task, and on his part he then strengthens others in the general effects. Therefore, suggestion ensures uniting continuity of the effects and actions of a community by pushing all in a certain direction and suppressing opposing efforts, while the effect promotes in the individual all like efforts and associations, strengthens and prolongs them. Suggestion does exactly the same for the herd. It takes care of the collective effect and thereby of the unity of effort and action. I would define this collective effect as only the sum of similar effects of the individuals. Psychological units which extend to several individuals, such as a collective consciousness, a collective will, does not exist in this sense. We may add that in men the relation of individuals among one another is determined in the first place by the affectivity, even if we leave out of consideration what we call sympathy and antipathy. One can see this in exaggerated form and in caricature, and therefore all the more strikingly in the insane. With the idiots, we deal much as would a father with his child, and we're in a continual affective relations with them. Alcoholics, general paralytics, manic patients find an affective response with us. Not always it is true in a positive sense, but we understand their failings and may act on them. With the hebephrenic, who intellectually often stands much nearer to us than the other demons, we find no affective rapport. We feel towards him like strangers, very much as towards a bird which we pet and which allows us to care for it, but never allows the intimacy which we quickly reach. For example, in our relation to the dog, the inhibited and falsified effect expressions of the hebephrenic place an insurmountable barrier between us and these patients, while all the intellectual derangements of the other groups do not render them so foreign to us. From this outline it follows: first, under simple circumstances, effects only are suggested. 2. Suggestion has exactly the same purpose for the community as the effects for the individual. 3. Animals suggest almost only effects. Suggestion, in which the intellectual content plays an essential role, occurs only in man, and even here is not frequent. And at the beginning we established 4. The action of suggestion is shown in the same ways and under the same circumstances as those of effects, whether the suggestion be an intellectual or an affective one. One might conclude from these facts that suggestibility cannot be separated from affectivity. One conception must comprehend both, and we may best call it affectivity. Hence, we can express our knowledge thus: suggestion is an affective process, suggestibility is a part of affectivity.